Hi, welcome everyone. We're here with Elaine Matthias on Real UX Stories. We have the privilege of working with Elaine as part of NANO for a number of projects, but today we're going to share one of her past projects to share a real story where we can talk about it from beginning to end. And we all know the terminology, we all know the UX webinars where we discover the topics and the methodologies, but we rarely hear how they're applied. We rarely hear the context in which they're used and the realities of it may not be such a pretty picture, it may not always come out perfect, but this is the real UX story. So let's dive in.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Elaine Matthias, and I'm a senior UX designer. A lot of my experience is in e-commerce. That is a pretty big business here in New York City, but I've done some other things as well. So I have actually two projects kind of queued up today so we can do a little compare and contrast. One of them is with Kendra Scott. Kendra Scott is a small jewelry business based out of Austin, Texas. They started as a distributor, so they were designing and manufacturing jewelry for retail outlets, and then eventually they launched an e-commerce store that is quite successful. It's a very beautiful store with lots of great jewelry. And since they launched their store a couple of years ago, they did open up a couple of brick and mortar locations, but they're predominantly all online sales. The other project that I'm going to just kind of compare that with, because I worked on two of these within like the same sort of 6-month window, is an AI project for the US Postal Service that was using AI measuring technology to kind of help people predict what sort of box they could use to ship their product. They could do this all from home instead of having to take the item into the post office. And then there was an e-commerce part to this project as well, where you could order and ship the boxes. And so that's kind of one of the nice things about e-commerce, is that a lot of times it's sort of secretly, well, not secretly, but it's so often we need to purchase and order things online that it's very rare that you have something that doesn't require some kind of financial purchasing component. As we mentioned, this is some user research that I worked on when I was working for another agency actually at the time, but this was under Optaros, which was, I think it's actually now called McCann e-commerce or McCann commerce or something. They've changed the name. But anyway, we were an e-commerce implementation shop, and I was on the user experience team. And we would do, as often as we could, we would try and kind of build in usability testing into our projects. It was very rarely something that was explicitly scoped for, but we would kind of just treat it as part of the discovery and loop it in, even if it was like just putting their existing site in front of our friends. So that's sort of one of the bigger differences between these two projects, is that like one of them was like super DIY, where we were literally just wrote up a plan, got it in front of some friends of ours, recorded the screens, and then shared the insights from that. And then the second project with the Postal Service, we had like a much larger team. We had UX people from like within the government weighing in on the testing plan. And then we actually had people coming into our office, into like a staged space where we were like recording their behaviors. One of the reasons I wanted to compare these two projects is that even though they're a bit different, the plan itself was really the same. In fact, I kind of used the Kendra Scott usability testing plan as like my template for almost every other usability testing plan I've done since, because I think that having like, you know, writing up a really simple goal, establishing the tasks and some of the success criteria, a lot of times those don't change a whole lot, but you need to be able to have like that section of content written into your plan so that you can have conversations with the other stakeholders about like what's coming from this. You know, a lot of user research in general is just kind of like, well, I think a lot of user experience in general, you're just translating information. So you're kind of like, there's so, you know, when, especially with complex projects, you're pulling information from here and there and all these different places. And then you're kind of tying it into a very nice bow to be like, okay, everybody understand what we're talking about. And so sometimes I find that even really obvious pieces of information, you know, such as like, if you look at, say, the success criteria on these two plans, like with the plan that you're viewing on the right, which is the US Postal Service, I state that the user can accurately explain what will happen when they start the experience. This is for onboarding. That seems like it should be a really obvious outcome of onboarding, but you have to kind of say it in order to make sure that everybody understands that that is an explicit and very simple result that you're looking for. Because surprisingly, oftentimes, even though you think they should be able to understand and explain what's happening, the user actually can't. They skip through it, their attention span is really limited, and they're just not paying close attention. Same thing with the discoverability, findability plan. This is for a search feature on an e-commerce site, right? So if you are running a search and you're getting results, you want to have an accurate list of potential products, and you kind of assume that's going to happen. But until you actually have an opportunity to look at a potential customer running search, you'll see all of the different ways that your search might fail for you. And so you kind of have to say that, like, we need an accurate list to result from whatever the search term is that we're kind of teeing up for them. You write up a scenario, kind of try and make it engaging and personable. You would kind of be surprised at how many times I've seen scenarios not be interesting at all. Just very formulaic. And so I try to add like a little bit of personality to that. Well, actually, you can see the difference between, well, it's not really a scenario on the right, I guess. You don't want your scenario to look like a goal, I think is what I'm trying to say. Like in the right with the onboarding objective, the goal, is like you read the screen, you understand the instructions, and you feel confident about what's going to happen next. And that directly leads into the success criteria that we're looking for. Whereas the scenario, it kind of gives you an opportunity to say, like, here is a real behavior that somebody might be engaging with. So it's not just as simple as like go into search and find something. It's like you saw your friend wearing a pair of earrings, you really thought they were cute, and you want your own pair. What happens next? I also find that it's really useful to kind of state like what you will be listening and watching for. This is actually secret language for like assumptions and biases. So that's kind of one of the really important parts of usability testing, I think, that's sort of unspoken, is that oftentimes if you don't do, you have to create opportunities and projects to actually write down what your assumptions and biases are about how the product is going to work. I think it's really important to use written language to actually lay that out in front of the different people on your team. We assume people can locate the right object. Like you set it up, you designed the search feature, you assume that it should work, right? And so then you have to kind of listen and watch for those experiences of like, what are the contexts when it doesn't work? And so that's what I think having this section in your usability plan is really useful for, is sort of asking questions and poking holes in those assumptions. In each of these, we actually had multiple parts and objectives. So I'm only showing one here because it gets a little bit repetitive, but in both of them, I used a 3-part testing plan. So oftentimes we're looking at more about like the life cycle of the single visit experience. Like with the US Postal Service example, onboarding was like the first touch point. And then the second touch point was actually using the measuring feature. And then the third touch point was like checking out and ordering the box that would fit the product you're trying to ship. So there were 3 parts to the overall testing plan, and we did that all within like one testing session for each test subject.
So essentially the mission for this jewelry company, I love this example here, the scenario of, saw, admired opal earrings, friend went to lunch, I now want to buy them. They mentioned Kendra Scott. I want to buy a pair for myself. Let me look online. So you're really setting up the scenario as real as possible for this task. And now you're basically saying, all right, before I run this test, my goal, my plan is to listen and watch for these things. Can they go for the search bar? How do they deal with the search results? Can they identify these products? Can they filter? It seems obvious, but not always. So I'm excited.
Yeah.
This is like, this is an interesting test. I'm curious how the participants did. I'm curious who the different types of participants were. Let's see how this unfolds.
Great. Both cases, we didn't use a recruiter. So with the jewelry company, Kendra Scott, in that instance, I was literally just drawing on my network. Like I called my sister and my best friend and like my colleague's wife and a couple of other people that were in our immediate network. And I just ran all of the tests with them. So I kept it, people around work. Like I just kept it really simple because I needed to do it quickly. I had only a couple of days, and it was just kind of an opportunity to look for potential opportunities in that instance. So it didn't have to be like highly structured. And I think for the most part, that's okay. Like if you're familiar with Steve Krug and his like DIY usability testing, this is kind of the same approach. He is really a big proponent of just like doing really quick, simple tests so you can get like immediate observations and then move on to like gather those up as like insights, look for patterns. I think that there are instances where the complexity warrants like a much more structured attention to detail and the types of people that you're participating, especially if you're working through like you're trying to figure out really specific audience segmentation. That would be an instance where you would probably want to have like more of a screener survey, and you might have like a more niche group of people that you need to draw from. With the U.S. Postal Service, I actually think that that was one of the biggest mistakes that we made in that project, where we just used people around the office. We did send out a screener survey, but it was pretty straightforward. And the screener survey served two purposes. We wanted to interview people who lived in New York City, but we also wanted to speak with people who lived in a more suburban environment. So we went out to our Princeton, New Jersey office. Ultimately, we didn't find any significant differences between like the two user bases based on that location. I don't think it really would have made a difference if we had not gone to Princeton. The other thing is that we wanted to identify different devices, so people who are using different Android devices and different iPhone devices. So that was kind of an important part of our process, was we wanted to really dive into like how the app experience differed between iPhone and Android. But the problem is that we just spoke with like random people. And in hindsight, the app was really better suited for people who are running e-commerce businesses. So like if you have an Etsy store, if you have like a real store where you're doing a lot of like secondhand selling of things in your closet or around your home, it's where you've got like a more significant package load than if you're just ordering from, you're just shipping out things here and there for the holidays, which is kind of the way we framed it. Like you're sending out a present. What box do you need? And the reason for that is, and I think this is maybe a larger strategic problem, is that the Postal Service is a very large and complicated organization, and their supply and distribution systems are only currently set up to send out boxes in packages of like 10 and 50. So when you got to like the right size box phase at the end of the app, you couldn't just order one box and have it delivered to your home. You had to have like 10 or 15. And so in that instance, like the app would have just generally been a lot more successful if we were framing it for people that were running businesses out of their home that needed a lot of shipping. And we didn't do that. And so I think that some of the results ended up being like not as helpful in the long run because we didn't do that. But I'll get to that at the end when I share some of the results. So this is the interview script. For me, this is the hardest part of the interviews, is actually like talking to people. I get really anxious. And so the interview script is like, I will schedule the interviews and then I will be like super afraid of doing it. And writing the interview script is kind of a relief. So it's like, okay, I don't have to like think about what I have to say because I have it all written here in front of me, and it like standardizes the entire conversation. So you're kind of funneling all the information through like the same parameters of conversation. And that makes it easier when you're like tracking everything and sort of identifying categories and insights that are emerging through the process of the conversations. Then it's all like, okay, you can see that like, we gathered these 10 insights during scenario 1, and like 5 of those insights are all really similar, so we can group them together. We saw 15 insights coming out of scenario 2, and 4 of them seem like they're really critical, even though they're not coming up as much as like maybe some other things, but they're so critical to like the usage of the app that maybe we need to look into that a little bit more closely. So it just kind of follows like the same structure that's coming out of like the actual like plan that you would share with the stakeholder. And now you're turning that information and you're making it customer or user focused.
No, but I just would love to commend you on making it a real UX story, because this is the reality of it. We don't always have access to the best participants, but we make do, and we design it as best we can. We're still nervous sometimes when conducting the test. We don't want to give any answers away. We don't want to redirect the user's results because of us. We want to be as neutral as possible. And I think it's very helpful to have a script like this where You know,
Mm-hmm.
it helps you stay focused, helps you stay reminded. Just like when a
Mm-hmm.
president gives a speech, he still has
Teleprompter. It
teleprompter.
helps. Mhm.
Yeah, you know, people still need cues. People still need assistance every now and then. It's just good to remember where you're at. So wonderful. Let's talk about this script, how you
Mhm.
designed it this way, why this way, and what resulted.
Basically, the design itself, as I mentioned, it follows the usability testing plan really closely. So you kind of set up the scenario, like you need to ship something. Like I said, this was kind of for an upcoming birthday. You aren't sure what size box you need, so you're going to try this new app. Will it work for you? And then it just helps you kind of, so then, you kind of set up the task. I find that it's like helpful sort of at the end of the task to maybe like engage with them slightly, like, kind of ask questions. How did you feel about that? On a scale of 1 to 10, like what was ease of use? Actually, and that was another kind of mistake that we made, is that one of my partners in the project wanted those numbers. And I wasn't at the time, like, I wasn't really as convinced. Like, it's a scale of 1 to 10. It's really arbitrary. Is that actually something we will need? So I wasn't as diligent about collecting that information, but I should have written it into the interview script. So at the end of the scenario 1, I should have posed the question, on a scale of 1 to 10, how easy was that for you to complete? And the reason that I regret not doing that is because we had inconsistent information on it at the end, and it would have looked really good in our reporting if we could have included that. But because he was the only one asking it when he was doing when he was leading the script, and then I wasn't actively asking it when I was leading the script, then we really couldn't use it, and it was a bit frustrating. Kind of just collected like, how do you feel sort of data. Even though it's a little bit arbitrary, I think that it would have given a really nice emotional component to the insights that we shared with the client. So we didn't have that, like, how do you feel kind of information. I think that at the end of this project, there were some pretty serious bugs in the app. And I think that if we had been able to share, people were excited about it. Like, they were frustrated, but they were excited. They liked watching the measurement happen. It scans the surface, and then it tells you how big the product, how much space you need, and then it shows you what size box. And we only had reporting data about the problems, and we didn't have like anything to kind of tie numerically to like how people felt excited by using the app. So I'll show you that a little bit at the end. I think it's pretty straightforward. I try to leave in like areas in the square brackets where you can ask follow-up questions. I try to keep the script to be like structured but flexible. But a lot of the times for me, the act of writing the script is cathartic, because then I feel more comfortable talking to people once I've got that in place. So these are a couple of examples of people using the measuring app. You can see we're in a workplace, but we brought in different surfaces and different products. With this particular project, the app, basically you go through an onboarding. So it's like 3 or 4 screens that tell you how the app is going to work. And then it launches, and it's basically like your camera view, but there's a scanning feature. So the surface, like the app itself, applies in the interface, like sort of these dots over the surfaces that you're viewing on the screen. And again, it's like your camera is activated.
The purpose of the app as a whole, the U.S.
Oh,
Post,
yeah.
is
Yeah.
so to capture using the phone. So the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Post Office wants you to download this app so you can do what?
So that you can measure things that you're going to ship, and therefore predict the right box size.
So this essentially, the mission, the goal of this app is to get
Mm-hmm.
you to the right box size.
Yeah.
You have an item in front of you, but you don't know what box size you need.
Exactly.
So instead of taking out a measuring tape, what if you just had a mobile app to help you figure this out?
Yes. Thank you.
No, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it's a super cool idea.
Yeah.
And obviously it's real. It's no longer an idea. So
No, it never went into production.
well, regardless, the test, you
Yeah.
had something to work with in terms of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
testing.
We had a prototype. Yeah.
You had a prototype. Sorry, you had
Yeah.
it's not just a concept in someone's head. There was actually a prototype that was tested.
Yeah.
And the reality, again, UX real stories. The fact that it was something that didn't live is also a testament to a real UX story, because we have plenty of case studies that may not have, went into production, but half of what UX is about is not always to give you perfect results. It's to give you results that tell you the reality of, is this worth it or is this not, and can save you a lot of money. So regarding this specific test, we know what the app purpose is. Now you have this test. You were describing the screen. So let's talk through that workflow. How does that app work now?
Yep. So the screen scans the surface that you're pointing the phone at. There's an interface that kind of shows you that the scanning is happening. And then there are like some small tools. The scanning is very quickly. It happens very quickly. And then it overlays a box on the object. So it detects that there's an object on the surface and it overlays a box. And it's just like a simple three-dimensional bounding box. And then that box has in the corners that you can resize it, like resizing signals. And so you can adjust the size of the box to kind of make sure that it fits around the product that you're shipping. So for this particular test, we use different surfaces. The app itself doesn't work well on white surfaces in general. So we kind of tried to avoid that. We use, but still using light colors, like you can see here with this like IKEA board. We wanted to use things that where people could kind of like stack products or things that were really soft and mushy next to things that were really like solidly square. So you can see we've got like a Scrabble box in the background. We're using a teddy bear in the image. Of the close-up of the guy, we have like a scarf and a pile of clothes that he's using.
How did you know to pick these items, or the client kind of helped you?
No, it was really arbitrary. Everybody was like,
Nice.
what's something you have at home? Like I had actually used the Scrabble game for we were naming a new brand. And so we did like a Scrabble game with the letters to kind of prompt some potential names. I had like a Scrabble game at my desk drawer.
Reusing one usability test into another.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
So this is the augmented reality portion. This is where you would see the box through their phone and to resize it through their phone, but it adds to that reality. Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't have images from the jewelry company because that was like just me sitting with my friends, but I do have some videos I can share in a minute.
Sure.
So when you hold the interviews, it should be pretty straightforward. It is time consuming. I think that's like the big thing to sort of keep in mind. There's setup time, breakdown time, actual time it's happening, but it's fun. I mean, people really enjoyed it. They had a blast. I got to meet a bunch of people in my office that I didn't know beforehand. So that was kind of cool. And then with like the Kendra Scott interviews, like my friends got to kind of see what I do, and so everybody was really excited about that. They were like, this is cool work. So here's the other part. Take notes as you go. So I think this is like the most important thing that you can do or have somebody doing with you during the usability testing. It makes everything so much easier at the end. So for me, I can be very extroverted, but when it's over, I feel a bit drained usually. And so at the end of the usability test, like the last thing I want to do is sit for an hour and do a write-up. So if you've kind of got things like jotted down some notes, you're keeping a spreadsheet, then it's a lot easier to kind of like scan through really quickly at the end and like pull out the insights and categorize things. So the spreadsheet that you see on the right, you can see at the very, very top, there are like a bunch of names and initials. And so all of those are the different tests that we were running. And then we had all of this set up in advance with this task. And then we were just going through and writing down like exactly what they were doing as they completed each task. So the tasks themselves that you see in the left column are all related back to tasks that were outlined in the usability plan. So they aren't new here at all. Like that's all stuff that we've previously written down, we've previously planned for. They're all connected to the success criteria and the goal that we're working with. And then we just took a lot of notes about what they were doing. I wrote down a lot of quotations. We were also recording these, but it was kind of, you don't really want to go back and have to look at the recordings like that unless it's like a point of contention or you need video for something to show a client. So it's just much easier to be able to scan through this. And then at the end, the reason you kind of want to keep an eye out for those insights as you go is because you want to loop them into these different categories. And those categories are really helpful for when you're presenting to the client and you can kind of narrow it down like, okay, at this particular point, there's a problem with choice confusion. People don't understand. And we saw choice confusion arise, at this point, and this point. And this is the behavior that was connected to it. And so it gives you like a real structure to deliver the results. And it keeps people from getting like too overwhelmed with all of the information that you're sharing or the potential problems in their product.
Gotcha. Just out of curiosity, I know there's a few here. Is there one in particular that you're more inclined or a fan of? Any favorite here?
No, but I will say that it differs for every project. So again, we're looking at like two different projects, and in part because I don't have like the same documentation for each one. Like with the postal service, which you see in the spreadsheet, those are notes that we were taking as we went. With the Kendra Scott stuff that you see on the left, where I actually have like the categories, even though they're pretty broad, I didn't take notes as I went. So I don't have like notes directly connected to that. We were pulling all of this from just like watching the videos, but I will show you in the next screen how we connected them to specific insights. Or actually you can kind of see that in the bottom slide, you know, like under complexity, address verification errors make it complicated during checkout. So we were able to kind of identify that these were different problems that were kind of related to this broader theme of complexity.
This is for Kendra Scott, the jewelry company?
Yeah, that's
Gotcha.
correct.
So there was a long scroll. There was lack of descriptive, inaccurate product filters. So it usually is a combination of things. But why is it important to divide it up into these four categories, to parse it out like this?
I think that people naturally gravitate towards categories, and so they're very anchoring. It tells you that like this is the problem looks like from a higher level. Like we know that we want to reduce cumbersome interactions in general in e-commerce because they're barriers to conversion. And so if that's, it's not necessarily like, I don't think the client would go like, okay, you know, we're going to start an agile sprint where we tackle all of the cumbersome problems. But it gives you kind of a sense of looking at things and you're like, okay, we know we've got a problem here. And so when you're kind of looking at the bigger picture of where you can make improvements to the app, it gives you a label to assign to different sections so you can see the pattern of problems. Not necessarily like, it can help you see the forest for the trees, if that helps.
No, absolutely. That totally makes
Yeah.
sense. And what do you think in terms of clients' priorities? Is this a good prioritization tool to help clients kind of decide?
So you can see this is where we were presenting to the client. So it's like we teed up these categories for Kendra Scott, you know, so this was like leading into actually presenting the data. And then as we presented the data, we had each problem tagged with more detail and a video. So now, like once we turn over the deliverable, which in this case was the deck, that makes it a lot easier for them to share it more widely. And those problems are really clearly labeled with the categories. So I think they're anchoring. It's like a cognitive anchor for people as they're going through. Instead of just seeing a list of like 15 potential problems, they're seeing like 15 problems, but those problems are narrowed into like 4 broad categories. And so that's what they're thinking about, is the broad categories, not the individual problems. So let me just kind of, so with the Kendra Scott stuff, that's the top row. And then the U.S. Postal Service is the bottom. So with the Kendra Scott stuff, you can see we just had like individual slides kind of outlining the problems. And I'll show some of the videos in a second. And then the bottom level, so this was, we would basically kind of tee up this like larger screen where we outlined what the success criteria was, we outlined what we were looking for, and then we stated the test outcome. So that's what you see happening in that table. And then we went through and we broke down those like testing outcomes into individual problems and paired it with quotations. And we have numbers there as well. So you can see like number 1, the tips and controls don't reorient with the user. So when you turn your phone to the side, the interface stays facing portrait, now you're in landscape, and that's very disorienting. And so we noted that 3 out of 19 participants experienced this friction. Another problem that we saw, which is the slide on the end for the Postal Service, is that they would recommend a box and then it would send you into this like ordering system, but there was no sort of notation about which was the right size box that you had been recommended. And 13 out of 19 participants commented on that they couldn't remember and had to go back to find out and write down what the recommended box size had been.
So just on that point, do you think the United States Postal Service knew that this was an issue and this validated for them, or was this a surprise for them?
I think that they knew it was an issue and it validated it.
And I guess what's the value for them in terms of validation? Was there internal political arguments that this helped solve? We want to proceed, but we just want to make sure if we put effort and budget into this, we want to make sure that this is the case, and therefore that's why we need the validation. What value did this provide for them?
So I think that for them, the validation was, or our intention was that it would help them prioritize. We wanted them to be able to say, like, these are the problems that we're going to tackle to improve the app. The overall goal of the testing plan was that they were really concerned. There was a lot of fear internally at the Postal Service that they were going to launch a product that got really bad reviews on the App Store. That's what they wanted to avoid. So ostensibly, what was happening is we were going to figure out what the biggest problem points would be and solve for those before they launched it. What ended up happening is they got so overwhelmed by the potential problems and like the lack of perfection that they decided not to launch it at all. I think that we could have done a better job of presenting the information in such a way that it wasn't overwhelming. Internally at the agency, we wanted to prove the value of running the test. And so we literally packaged up all the information. Like, I don't think that we should have included problems where 3 out of 19 people commented on a potential friction. In hindsight, you know, it was interesting information to us, and it showed that we were doing a lot of work for them, but I don't think that it was helpful for the larger strategic picture.
Why do you say that?
It was way too much information. And there wasn't like, it's not a nice experience when like the tips and controls don't reorient with the user, but we were measuring things that people were saying. So the friction was still there, but it didn't bother 16 out of 19 of those participants. They just like figured out how to work the phone. And so I don't know that like that was really useful in like the grand scheme of things.
You don't think it really reflected the true story if someone just looked at that one line?
Yeah. I mean, it's not great. Like if we were talking about it internally, we'd be like, oh, the app shouldn't do that. Like that's a terrible experience. But the reality of the testing was that like of all of the outcomes, it wasn't really something that needed to be like dealt with immediately.
And then let's talk through Kendra Scott a little.
Yeah, so let me roll a couple of these videos. So the first one is, so this was related back to that first example where we were talking about search and can people find things that they're searching for. So this clip, so you can see she's on her phone. She has opened up the navigation. She's kind of scanning. And
interesting navigation. I like the left-hand side version.
You can see here, okay, so just looking at the navigation options, you have new and now. This is a jewelry store, jewelry, fine jewelry, and then things like customize. And so when she opens up the customize tab, she goes into jewelry, and then you have like all of your standard jewelry, but she's commenting on the fact that she doesn't know the difference between jewelry and fine jewelry. And she doesn't necessarily know the difference between jewelry, fine jewelry, and what is essentially customizable jewelry. So it's like, it's all of these kind of like different terminologies to reference jewelry when she already knows that she's on like a jewelry website. And so she's not like really quite sure where to go because it's all jewelry. Whereas I think what she is kind of suggesting is that she knows she's looking for earrings. And so she doesn't really understand why earrings isn't like a top line navigation. And then from within earrings, she can start to differentiate. Do I want customizable earrings? Do I want costume jewelry earrings? Do I want diamond fine jewelry earrings? So I think that for her is the confusing part.
And regarding the task, so she's particularly looking for what? She's
looking for those opal earrings.
She's looking through, she sees all these categories. She's not quite sure where would she click on to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it in jewelry? Is it in fine jewelry? Is it a type of earring where it's customizable because you can pick the gems? Like, what if that particular style, the customization is like you can choose diamond, you can choose jade, you can choose opal, you could choose just plain silver in that particular style. She's not sure.
So what is the forced path that existed before? Mm-hmm. And then you obviously see the issue with that forced path, which is why you are recommending or showing this insight. And then what would the recommended path be?
Probably jewelry to earrings, and then a filter for opal, which kind of brings me to my next example.
Awesome.
So opal is I just want to point out, opal is a gem. In this instance here, so she's kind of landed on the product listing page, and she's looking for opal earrings, but she chose not to apply any of the filters. And that is because the filters, you have colors and you have metals, and they're like the same. So cognitively, how do you parse through that information?
Right. For someone who doesn't know color from a metal and there's no labels on it, no names on it, it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
So she didn't even think twice. She just moved on.
I don't know what this magenta metal is. Also, diamonds and opals are very similar in color. So it's kind of hard to figure out, like, it wasn't even a metal, it's a stone. So like you've got people looking for stone, specifically for stones, but they're only listed as colors.
I guess you knew that there was an issue, but how do you know that there's an underlying issue? Like, how do you know that it's the labels that caused her to skip it versus she just thought it was an ad and tried to skip it, or she thought it was all colors. She didn't even notice that there was a metal section because it all blended in together and she skipped it. Like, how do you know why she skipped it?
Well, it was actually a pattern. So we didn't do nearly as many tests for this one, but there were, and this is obviously, I'm just showing one video, but it happened a couple of times where people couldn't find like opal. And the reason that we put opal, or the reason that we picked something like a specific term, is because they use that a lot in their descriptors. Like you can see in this video over here, where it's like they're talking about, the product title says in gold, in black opaque glass. So they're using those descriptive terms when they're talking about their jewelry, and then it's not necessarily like folding over into the search filters that they're providing for people. So there isn't like a really clear alignment between the filters that they're providing and the product needs they're using. So we were kind of drawing also on like our own internal expertise when we were talking about some of these things. So that was kind of how we were coming at it as well.
And in this particular case with Kendra Scott, a lot of people tend to ask, when it comes to a well-funded scientific study with thousands of participants, you can get statistically significant and all that. But the reality is UX scientists are pragmatic scientists. They work very quickly trying to accomplish a goal. They're not here to publish a paper. They want to tell people what to do as the next move. So when creating this, quick tests, there's still scientific tests in terms of the scientific method. You have a hypothesis. You're getting a few participants, not just one outlier. How many participants I know you see 19 on the U.S. Postal Service in the bottom. How many did you feel right was for Kendra and how much for the United Postal Service? Was there a difference and why?
Yeah, so with Kendra, it was like 5. As I mentioned, it was really just me kind of trying to gather information for them. They were like, we know there's some problems. We could see internally that they were having a really hard time prioritizing. Like we had an existing relationship with the client. They have a full-on internal e-commerce team. Those people know that there are problems, but there was just a lot, like it had been kind of like months of conversation. And we were like, all right, we need to kind of do something really quick and easy where we can help them get a real grasp of like what's going on and help them figure out basically what they want to work on. So that was sort of one of the larger goals of this. There was some other stuff going on as well in the background. This was part of like a much larger kind of presentation spanning a bunch of different skill sets internally. But for the UX team specifically, we wanted to help them with prioritization. With the Postal Service, the real concern internally was like launching a product that was going to get bad reviews and reflect poorly on the brand. There were even a lot more people involved. It was a lot more, there was a lot more cross collaboration with the Postal Service as well. Like Kendra Scott wasn't really involved at all in these tests. Like I wrote the testing plan, I approved it with my UX lead, and then I just kind of went and did it over a couple of days. With the Postal Service, like we had them approve it. They sent it off to people that are working within, I think it's, govability.org to review. So I got a lot of feedback from like that team within the federal government. And then they wanted more data. But like I said, I also feel like part of that problem is that we were kind of trying to prove our value to them as well. And so everybody was like, we had a group of like 8 people working on this, and they were all really excited to be involved, and they wanted, all kinds of people that they knew to come participate. And they don't do this sort of stuff with the Postal Service. It's this agency. A usability test is fairly rare. So I think people were really excited to see it like happening.
How did you help them overcome that?
Help them overcome their excitement or help them get focused.
Was it even something needed to overcome? Are you excited to have more people involved, or do you try to just limit the amount of people involved?
I prefer to limit the amount of people involved. In this instance, it was really helpful because there was always somebody there to like, I couldn't interview 19 people on my own. Like that's just way too much. So it was nice to have somebody to tag team with in the interviews. And then we also oftentimes had like, she was more like an associate level person on the project side, just sitting in with us. And so she was always willing to help take notes. And so it was kind of nice to have like a more objective note taker. And then just in terms of like gathering all the stuff up and having people to like help run errands and help go fetch things, it was helpful from that perspective. But I don't think that we needed to talk to 19 people to get the results that we did. In fact, I think that was maybe part of the problem. Is we talked to too many people, and then we had too many results and too many data points. I think that we could have gotten, like, I think that if we had had 4 out of 5 participants talk about how they couldn't remember which boss was recommended, that would have been enough to drive change, and we wouldn't have overwhelmed the clients nearly as much. I can also touch the middle video for Kendra Scott, where they don't really have like descriptive metadata to narrow results. So they have these really expensive product titles, but that information doesn't really surface very well in search. And so you still get like a lot of search results that kind of.
I was going to say, why doesn't someone just, instead of trying to navigate through the menu, if I fail a few times, the next thing I would probably do is just go straight to search. So when you were referring to meta, that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, metadata is stuff that's like keywords that are included on the back end, like when you're entering the product information.
And their search experience just wasn't able to catch some of these things.
No, and in this instance, actually, one of the things that we wanted them to do was upgrade their search experience. We wanted them to upgrade their search experience. So at that point in time, there was kind of a shift from like just type words into a box and get search results to like type words into a box and get all of these really smart, the pop-up window appears and you have things that are like categorized, and you have things that it's like you can get content, you can get product, you can get product based on certain, it would do a lot of that stuff before you even went to the search results page. And so we were kind of trying to nudge them towards upgrading to that particular feature because we saw it being much more standardized across the industry at the time.
And did they know their search result was bad? They just didn't know how much?
Yeah, I think they kind of knew. Again, a lot of this is helping them prioritize stuff to work on internally. Right. And so that had been like part of the broader conversation of like, where do we want to spend our resources? And we were kind of trying to nudge them towards like that particular feature. Yeah, they were honestly going to have to do it anyway. I mean, now you see that kind of search pretty universal. And this is a couple of years old at this point. So now that sort of stuff is pretty universal. But at the time, it wasn't as widely adopted. And so, it's, making those kind of changes to your search, that can be a pretty heavy financial overhead. But it was going to have to happen eventually. So we were just kind of trying to nudge them towards it.
If we had unlimited money and unlimited resources, we'd fix everything right away all the time. But this definitely helped put a run through so we actually have a realistic plan.
I mentioned this early on, but like, especially with Kendra Scott, like we just did it. Like it wasn't super, I wouldn't even argue that it was scientific. Like we were just looking for some really basic patterns to like have a conversation and help them prioritize. We saw a client problem more than we saw like an actual usability problem. And so we just wanted to go in and talk to them like in a really structured way about potential improvements. I try to do this with almost every project. Like I don't even scope it a lot of the times. It's just like, in order to get to this deliverable, I'm going to have to do this sort of action.
Was it worth doing all this? How did this go?
So with Kendra Scott, it was great. They continue to have a really excellent website that's super usable. I know that they invested in the search feature. I'm not quite sure what happened with the navigation. I actually left the company not long after this project, so I'm not quite sure what happened with some of the navigation and product filters, but I do know that they did feel like it was helpful in terms of prioritization and sharing information internally with stakeholders. As I mentioned with the Postal Service, that's a much more complex project with like lots of moving parts, and so they ended up not launching it at all. This project too, there was an agency that approached the Postal Service about doing this because I think they had brainstormed the idea and they wanted to learn how to use the technology. So the project itself didn't even originate internally. It was like another agency that said, we'll give you a really good deal if you would work with us on this particular new technology. And the Postal Service went for it. But I think that ultimately there was so much internal indecision and fear that there's a lot going on there bureaucratically, and it's not a super digitally mature organization. So I think that they just were too nervous about the potential fallout to the brand.
Got it. And just to end on this note, a lot of people, may want to do this themselves. They might want to go to others. If either of these clients just tried to do it internally with their teams, do you think they would have gotten the same insights? Do you think they would have, reach the same
Mhm.
point? Well, what's the value of essentially
Mhm.
going one way or the other?
Yeah, I do think they would have. Honestly, I think that with Kintra Scott, they would have gotten to the same prioritization issues if they had carved out the time to do it themselves. I think in e-commerce in general, the sort of funnel of pages through conversion is really consistent and set, and like the interesting stuff happens when you try to apply the brand needs over that. And so a lot of times people think that they're experts because you've done, after you've done 5 or 6 e-commerce projects, you really know the flow. It's homepage to category page to product grid, the product detail page to cart and checkout, right? Like it's pretty set. But once you start overlaying brand stuff, it gets a lot, it changes a lot. There's a lot of crazy different things that can happen. And so that's where usability testing becomes really important. So like I consider myself an expert in e-commerce. I know a lot about it. I have access to a lot of different interesting projects that I've worked on over the years. And the one thing that comes away is like it's kind of, I use the example of chairs. Like everybody knows how a chair works, right? Like it has 4 legs, it has a seat, it has a back, like maybe it has a back, maybe it doesn't, but there's so many infinite variations. There's that like 500 chairs book. I feel the same way about e-commerce. There's just so many infinite variations that like, just because you think you know exactly how all the pages should line up doesn't necessarily mean that your customer is going to use it that way.
Users never comply. Scientists with a background for studying, you would know right away
Yeah.
how this user would use a particular chair, insights about
Precisely.
them.
Yeah.
But awesome. All right. Well, thank you so
Cool.
much for your time, Elaine.
Yeah,
I
thanks
definitely
for
learned a lot.
sharing.
Thank you for giving us the real insight and the real behind the scenes, insights to not only the insights that came out of your results, but your process. The insights to your process was very helpful. And this was fun. Thank you so much.